The Ledger of Snow. Idea by Allen Di Benedetto. The letter arrived on the 9th of November, which Julian would later find significant. Only in the way a man finds significance in the precise shape of a scar. Not because the date mattered, but because it was the last ordinary thing he could point to. It was written in his father's hand, though the hand had gone unsteady, in a way Julian had not seen before. The letters leaning into one another, like old men sharing a secret. It did not say, "I am dying." It said, instead, "I find I am tired in a manner that sleep does not answer," which Julian understood, reading it twice at his kitchen table in Boston, with the radiator ticking its small complaints, to mean the same thing, dressed for company. His father asked him to come home. Not for Christmas. Julian was 34 years old, and had spent 11 of those years building a life that had nothing whatsoever to do with the North, in either the geographic or the mythological sense. He designed bridges, not the romantic kind that appear on postcards, but the unglamorous municipal kind that carry commuters over unremarkable rivers. And he had come to love the honesty of steel, the way a beam either held the load or it did not, the way a calculation was either correct or it was a lie waiting to be discovered by gravity. There was no ambiguity in his work. He had chosen the profession, he sometimes admitted to himself late at night, precisely because ambiguity had exhausted him as a boy, and he had spent his adult life building a moat of certainty around a childhood that had none. He told his fiancée, Marguerite, that his father was unwell and that he would be gone a week, perhaps 2. He did not tell her why the prospect of the visit made his hands unsteady, in the same way his father's handwriting had become unsteady, as though the family affliction, whatever it was, had already begun its slow transmission down the wire of blood between them. He did not tell her, because he had never told her, what his father did for a living. The house sat at the end of a road that stopped being a road, roughly 4 miles before it reached the house, becoming instead a suggestion, a habit of packed snow that other, older vehicles seemed to know by memory rather than sight. Julian had learned to drive on that road. He had learned, more precisely, to drive on it in December, in the particular blue dark of 4 in the afternoon, with his father beside him saying nothing, which was his father's way of teaching everything. His father was thinner than the letter had prepared him for. This did not surprise Julian so much as confirm something he had already, privately, calculated, that a man who worked as his father worked, at the pace his father worked, for as many years as his father had worked, would eventually present a bill for the labor, the way any structure eventually presents a bill for the loads it has carried without complaint. "You've grown a beard," his father said, by way of greeting. Which was not true. Julian had not grown a beard. It was only that his father's eyes had begun, in this last year, to arrange the world according to a private and increasingly unreliable logic, seeing in his son's jaw the ghost of what the jaw would eventually become, as though time in that house ran in more than one direction at once, and old men could see around its corners. "I haven't," Julian said, "but he'll take it as a compliment if you meant it as one." "I meant it as an observation," his father said. "Come inside. It is cold enough to embarrass us both." The house was, as it had always been, larger on the inside than the outside architecture accounted for, in a way that no visitor ever remarked upon, because no visitor's eye was permitted to linger on it long enough to notice. Julian had grown up believing this was simply what houses were like, the way a fish is reported to be ignorant of water, and it was not until his first semester of college, describing his childhood home to a roommate, over a beer, that he understood from the other boys' careful, humoring silence that most houses did not have this quality, and that describing it further would end the friendship, or begin a much longer and stranger conversation than either of them wanted at 19. They sat in the kitchen, which was the room his father trusted for difficult conversations, on the theory, never stated but long understood, that a man says truer things over a cutting board than he does in a study built for the purpose of saying important things, that rooms built for gravity produce only theater, while rooms built for soup produce confession. "In retiring," his father said, and set down his spoon with the particular care of a man who has rehearsed a sentence so many times that the saying of it, when it finally comes, feels almost anticlimactic, like the last step of a staircase, taken in the dark, that turns out not to be there at all. From the business, Julian said. He did not phrase it as a question, because there was no other business his father could mean. And because phrasing it as a question would have required Julian to say the word aloud, and he had spent 11 years arranging his life so that he would not have to. From the business, his father agreed. I'm 71 years old in this body, Julian, whatever that comes to in the other reckoning, and I find that the sleigh takes more out of a man than it used to. Or I take more out of myself than I used to. It is difficult to say which, and I'm not sure the distinction matters at the altitude we're discussing. No one simply stops, his father said, with the first real edge Julian had heard in his voice since arriving. That's rather the trouble I've come to discuss with you. Here Thorne's narrator, adopting for a page the coldness of an actuary, might pause to lay out the mechanism of succession, as Julian's father explained it that night, and several nights following. Over the same kitchen table, the soup replaced eventually by whiskey, the whiskey eventually by nothing at all, but the two of them, and the tick of a clock that Julian had never, in 34 years, seen anyone wind. The mantle, as his father called it, was not magic in the sense that children imagined a wand wave, a wish granted. It was closer, his father said, to a debt structure of extraordinary scale, a promise made so long ago and renewed so many times that the promise itself had become a kind of physical law, binding on whoever held it in roughly the way that a signature binds a man to a mortgage, which is to say completely, and without regard for how the man's feelings about the mortgage might have changed since the signing. You don't choose it, exactly, his father said. And you don't inherit it, exactly, either, though inherit is the nearest word we have. It is closer to being handed a ledger that's already open, with your name already written at the bottom of it, in ink you didn't provide, and being asked whether you would like to pick up the pen. And if I say no, then the ledger closes itself, eventually in its own time, and something else opens, instead. I don't fully know what. My own father didn't fully know, when he asked me, what would have happened if I had refused him. There has never been a refusal in our line, not that anyone kept record of, though I suspect a refusal wouldn't be the sort of thing that gets written down, given who does the writing. Julian found that his coldest, most useful analytical faculty, the one that checked load-bearing calculations twice before signing off on a bridge that strangers would trust with their lives, had gone entirely silent in the face of this, offering no purchase, no angle of entry. There was no beam here to test. There was only his father's face, gone soft and old in the lamplight, asking him a question that had no correct answer, only a chosen one. Why me, Julian said, and not someone who would want it? Because it doesn't go to someone who would want it, his father said. That's rather the whole design of the thing, if design is the word. Wanting it is, historically, disqualifying. Every man in our family who wanted it too visibly, too hungrily, was passed over by his own father in favor of a son who hesitated. I hesitated when your grandfather asked me. I stood exactly where you're standing, metaphorically. God knows literally, too. This kitchen doesn't seem inclined to move, and I told him I had plans of my own. I wanted to teach. Did you know that? Before all this, I wanted, very badly, to teach 8th grade mathematics in a public school in Hartford, and I had the position offered to me, and I turned it down for this, and I have spent 43 years telling myself I do not regret it, which is either true, or is the kind of thing a man says so many times, that the saying becomes indistinguishable from the truth. Julian did not sleep that night, nor the next, and on the third night his father, without asking permission or offering apology, took him out to see the operation itself, which Julian had glimpsed only in fragments as a child, kept mostly from the working parts of the house, the way other children were kept from their father's offices, not out of secrecy exactly, but out of a sense that certain machinery ought not be watched by eyes too young to weigh what they were seeing. He had expected, insofar as he had allowed himself to expect anything, some version of the postcard image, elves, whatever elves might turn out to actually be, workshops lit gold, a general Christmas card cheer humming beneath the surface of things. What he found instead, descending a staircase that should not have fit inside the house's outer walls, was something closer to what he recognized from his own profession. A vast, quiet, and extraordinarily well-engineered system. Load distributed and redistributed across 1,000 small competencies. None of them magical in isolation, all of them magical in aggregate, in the way a suspension bridge is not magical in any single cable but becomes, in the totality of its design, something that looks, to the uninitiated eye, very much like a miracle, holding up a highway. There were workers. Yes, though they did not resemble anything. Julian had been led by 40 Decembers of cultural instruction to expect. They were, for the most part, ordinary in appearance and extraordinary in focus, moving through their tasks with the specific, unhurried competence of people who have done a thing so many times that doing it has become a form of rest rather than labor. An old woman was calibrating something that Julian's engineer's eye recognized, with a jolt he did not examine too closely, as a stress distribution problem nearly identical to one he had solved for a footbridge in Providence the previous spring, except that what she was distributing was not weight but wish, or need, or some third thing the ledger accounted for, that had no word in Julian's vocabulary yet. It runs itself mostly, his father said, watching Julian's face rather than the room. That surprises people. They think it is all will, all magic conjured fresh each year by some enormous effort of belief. It isn't. It is infrastructure, same as your bridges. What it needs from the man at the top isn't magic. It is judgment. Someone has to decide every year, in 10,000 small cases, what a child actually needs against what a child has asked for. And those two things diverge more often than you would credit, and the deciding is the whole job. Really, the sleigh is theater. The judgment is the work. That sounds, Julian said carefully, like something I already do. Different units. Same math. His father almost smiled. I've noticed you built your whole life to resemble the family trade with the enchantment sanded off. I've wondered, watching you these 11 years from a greater distance than either of us would like. Whether that was flight or apprenticeship, I still don't know. Perhaps you don't either. It would be false, and Thorne was not a writer inclined toward the false comforts of narrative symmetry. To say that Julian's week at his father's house resolved into clarity, it did not. He telephoned Marguerite twice, said less than he meant to both times, and hung up feeling that he had failed her in some way he could not yet name. A debt he was accruing against a currency he had not yet learned to spend. He thought of the 8th grade mathematics classroom his father had never stood in front of the 43 Decembers. His father had spent turning that unlived life over like a stone worn smooth from handling, unable to put it down and unable, either, to make it into anything but an old ache visited on quiet nights. He thought of his own bridges, the 7 of them now standing, steel and certainty, carrying strangers over rivers without asking whether the strangers deserved the crossing. He thought that perhaps this was the actual inheritance his father had given him already, years ago, without either of them naming it. Not the ledger, but the fear of the ledger, the fear so total that it had built an entire competent, admirable, real life as its wall. On the last night, his father asked him, finally, directly, the question the whole visit had been circling the way Thorne's own characters so often circled the true subject of a scene for pages before naming it. Will you take it up? Julian found that the answer, when it came, surprised him less than he had expected it to. The way a bridge's final resonant frequency is not a surprise to the engineer, who has been quietly modeling it for months. Only a confirmation of a number that had been sitting, unspoken, in the calculations all along. No, he said, not because I don't understand what it is now. I think I do, better than I did a week ago. Not because I think it is beneath me, or beneath you, or because I have contempt for it. I don't. I watched that old woman calibrating wish against need for 3 hours, and I thought it was the most honest engineering I have ever seen. But I built a life, Dad. It doesn't carry the whole world's Decembers. It carries a few thousand commuters a year over a few rivers that otherwise have to go around. But I built it, plank by plank, specifically because it was mine to build. And I don't think I can hand it back now without becoming the kind of ghost you've been for 43 years, standing at a window that looks out on a classroom you never taught in. His father was quiet long enough that Julian began to catalog. with the old dread returning. Every way the silence might resolve into disappointment. I asked your grandfather, his father said finally. What would happen to me if I refused? Not to the business. To me, he didn't know, or wouldn't say. I've spent 43 years being grateful, and resentful, and grateful again, in a cycle I never fully broke. I'm going to tell you something I don't think he told me, because I don't think he knew it yet himself. At 71, the way I know it now. He reached across the table and put his hand, papery and cold despite the kitchen's warmth. The ledger doesn't need a martyr, Julian. It has needed one. In this family, for 4 generations. And I think that's precisely why it has kept finding one. It needs only someone with good judgment who's willing to serve for a while. It never once required that the willing man give up everything else he was. I gave up everything else because I believed, wrongly, that the size of the sacrifice was the proof of the worthiness. You've just told me something I should have told your grandfather 60 years ago and never had the courage to test. What happened to the ledger? In the end, Thorn leaves for the space between chapters rather than the page itself, in keeping with his lifelong suspicion of endings too neatly delivered. What can be said is this: Julian did not inherit the Mantle whole, the way his father had, the way every father in that line had for 4 generations before him, each passing down not only the ledger, but the specific and crushing belief that the ledger required the whole of a man to carry it. He inherited, instead, a Tuesday, one Tuesday a month, beginning the following January. Julian drove the 4 miles of suggestion, that was Onsa Road, to sit with the old woman who calibrated wish against need, and to lend his particular cold, exact, bridge-building judgment to the 10,000 small decisions the work required. Judgment his father had been right to notice he already possessed, honed on rivers and commuters rather than reindeer and rooftops. But the same judgment nonetheless. The rest of the month belonged to Steele, to Marguerite, to the smaller, and Julian came to believe, no less honest bridge he was building of his own life. His father did retire that year, from the sleigh and the rooftops and the whole visible pageant of it, though he kept, until the end of his own long life, a hand in the ledger's quieter arithmetic, teaching, as it turned out, being not so different, a labor whether the students were 8th graders, or the small competent army, required to keep a 400-year-old promise, solvent, through one more December. And if there is a moral to be extracted from Thorn's tale, which he would have resisted, on principle, ever stating outright, it might be only this, that the heaviest inheritances are not the ones we are asked to carry, but the ones we assume, without ever being told so directly, that we must carry entirely alone, or not at all. The bridge, Julian had learned long before his father ever wrote him, that letter in an unsteady hand does not need to bear the whole load by itself. It needs only to be well built and to trust, at certain calculated points, the columns that were placed there to help. The end.